are now entering Nick and Melo's hyperspace.
Hello, I'm Carmelo, and my favorite episode of The Mandalorian is The Jedi, Chapter 13. Everything Ahsoka, I adore.
I had a feeling, and I didn't want to pick the same one as you, so I picked something different. I'm Nick, and my favorite episode of The Mandalorian is episode 3 of season 1, where Mando goes back and saves Grogu from the client. And Deborah Chow wonderfully directed one of the coolest episodes, I think, in all of Star Wars.
It's beautiful. Chapter 3, The Sin.
The Sin, yes. Such a good episode.
I've been trying to memorize the titles of all the episodes, like a good fan. In our Journey Through Hyperspace, we examine everything and anything Star Wars from the point of view of two lifelong fans, one young, one old, came together through the will of the Force.
Yes, and in this episode, as you guys probably guessed, we are talking about The Mandalorian, specifically the first 2 seasons, because that's all we have at this time. We're not really going to speculate much on season 3, but we just want to talk about the beautiful series that has just kind of sparked so much love in the fan base, and just talk about what we love about it and just the impact it's made on Star Wars the last few years.
And I think we can spill a little bit into the couple of episodes from Boba Fett as well,
yes,
because it's sort of part of the story. So we might spill into that just a little bit as we talk about it. I think it's really interesting to think of the show as almost like a comeback to Star Wars, because we have been talking about this, how there are people who have seen a few of the movies or remember the old movies, and they're coming back to Star Wars because of The Mandalorian. I have friends in Puerto Rico who it is because of The Mandalorian that they're watching Rebels, that they're watching Clone Wars, that they're going back to the prequel movies. And so this has really become a phenomenon.
Yeah, it's the first live action Star Wars TV series.
Right.
Of course, we got other Star Wars TV series in the past, but this was something I think a long time coming. I think for years, George Lucas kind of had the idea of a Star Wars TV show that isn't too dissimilar to this. I believe it was going to be like Star Wars Underworld. I don't know if that was the official title.
Correct.
And I think some of the elements of that show kind of bled into this, and obviously it's much different time period, different creative team. But it's the idea of a live action Star Wars TV series has always kind of been out there, and it's been an idea floated around. And I think neither one of us kind of expected the show to be as popular as it has. Like, it's kind of taken not just Star Wars, but like kind of pop culture by storm. Like, I
didn't know what to expect. I remember seeing a little bit of the teasers and thinking, oh yeah, that could be interesting. I wasn't like, oh my God. I was excited about the idea of a live action, but I just didn't know what to expect. I didn't know what to expect. And of course, as we all know, and everybody who's watching knows, once Grogu shows up at the very end of episode 1, the world exploded.
Yeah.
There are so many videos of people reacting to Baby Yoda, as they called him then, out of the little crib. That was just sort of like the world is divided into before Grogu and after Grogu.
He's
whether you're a Star Wars fan or not, because Walgreens is filled with Grogus. It's really interesting how many of the elements of Star Wars are sort of distilled into the show. The cute factor, the sort of like the badassness, the battles, the nostalgia, all of those elements that we have been sort of building through the original trilogy, the prequel trilogy, Clone Wars, all of that, even Rebels, all of that sort of, when this shows up, all of that sort of gets inserted in there. And it's a really interesting distillation. I think that's a perfect word. A distillation of all the things that we think of when we think of Star Wars are present in The Mandalorian.
Yeah, it's fascinating how, to me, this show is, it doesn't really do anything different. It's not reinventing the wheel. It's not breaking really any new ground.
Okay.
It is filmmaking wise with the volume and things like that.
Right.
But the story itself, I don't think it's doing anything that we haven't really seen before. And I think, you're very well familiar with this, Carmelo, that pop culture goes in cycles of nostalgia. And I think of other things that are really popular the last few years, along with the Mandalorian, like Stranger Things and
Right. Right.
things like that. Things that were very popular, say the 80s and 90s. They're kind of making their way back now, and I think the Mandalorian, with it being a very just straightforward tale of a man doing the right thing and protecting an innocent life and trying to protect this innocent life, is
Yeah.
kind of something we've always seen this, and it's not new. It's just kind of got that Star Wars sticker on it.
It is. It is. If I could put my cynical hat for a moment, it is an amazing piece of marketing.
Yeah.
Because they sort of thought through what makes Star Wars, what makes the fans love Star Wars. And so bringing back the genre of the Western,
yes,
which was not really in the prequels, and was not really in the animated shows, but this is sort of going back to the genre of the Western that Kurosawa in Japan absorbed, and that Lucas absorbed from Kurosawa. And so it's really interesting that sort of adopting the idea of the Western. I did a marathon. I'm just telling the audience, I'm just going to do a confession. I did a marathon of The Mandalorian for the last 5 days. And it's just been really interesting seeing all of the tropes of the Western, the characters, the stories, the settings, the notion of the law, the notion of honor, the notion of the outlaw. All of those things are sort of mixed up in the story of The Mandalorian. And the show is constantly using those old tropes and using them in the world of Star Wars, but sort of constantly making references to the Western. And it's just really well done. It's just really well done.
Yeah, it is. It's beautiful. I think the imagery, as like you said, it draws back from so many classic spaghetti westerns and so many tropes that are, and westerns really haven't been popular in our culture in a long time. So to younger fans, it's not really. They may recognize some of the tropes, but most of these tropes they may not even realize are a trope.
That's
true.
That's
really fascinating how they're able to reinvent
true.
that and kind of put it out there and make it accessible for everybody. If you were to do like just a straight up Western today, I don't know if it would do very well compared to you do it in space with a cute little alien and a badass bounty hunter, and it works. Everybody can relate to it and everybody enjoys it.
It's really interesting when I teach my Star Wars class and we talk about Westerns. I play the beginning of the main theme of The Mandalorian, and then I play the main theme of the good, the bad, and the ugly. And they're so related. I'm terrible at, I'm not going to hum or sing right here because I don't want to scare anybody, but listen to those two. And, one has a 70s feel, the other one has a 2020 feel, but the same idea of the music, one is a reference of the other. The Mandalorian is clearly making a reference to the spaghetti Western from the 1970s. And so it's really interesting how not only the story, but even the music is sort of playing with the notion of the Western as it is seen. And you're right, Nick, that you don't need to know the Westerns because the Western has been absorbed in so much of pop culture that people can identify things without really saying, oh yeah, this is spaghetti Western from 1971, Sergio Leone. Like, you don't need to know that.
Right.
If you do, it's really exciting. But if you don't, you still have a connection. You still have a connection without having the direct reference to it.
Right. Well, and even to the show and the Book of Boba Fett both kind of play off of Western tropes where, the badass Western main character works with indigenous people, and that kind of trope is very familiar, and I've seen that. And my grandfather used to watch Westerns when I was younger, so I've seen a lot of Westerns. I don't really remember names and actors, but I remember seeing them, and as I get older, I realized that a lot of them were very similar, but there are some distinctions, and I saw a lot of those common threads. And I when I watched The Mandalorian, I thought, wow, I feel like I've seen this before.
It's everywhere.
It's very fascinating,
I never, when I was a film major, I never took a class on the Westerns, but we watched lots of Westerns. And then growing up in Puerto Rico, I was never really interested in Westerns. But when I was in film school, I just sort of realized this is like an American institution.
Yeah.
So I started watching all of these Westerns from the 30s all the way to the 50s. And a lot of the stuff that I remember studying in film school sort of shows up in The Mandalorian in a really, really interesting way. I think it would be really fun to talk about what The Mandalorian does to our story of The Mandalorian.
Yeah.
Because it's really fun adding so much lore and so much content to what the little bit we know. We almost know nothing about the Mandalorians in the original trilogy. We just know Boba Fett has a Mandalorian armor. The novels talk a little bit about that, but it's not really until Clone Wars that we get a little more information. So you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think it's we kind of get plopped in the middle of the history of the Mandalorians, where we are when this show starts. The series starts shortly after the original trilogy, and we've seen bits and pieces of during the show about the New Republic, and they're trying to kind of tame the remnants of the Empire and make it more peaceful and civilized. And it's funny. I really, when the show was announced and they called him the Mandalorian, I thought in my head, speculating, I thought, is he going to be the last of the Mandalorians? Like, have the Mandalorians gone away?
Oh,
and of course, that's not the case. But that's okay.
Right.
The way that they're kind of non-existent. He's really the only one because we see in the first couple of episodes the Vizsla, one of the bigger Mandalorians, he says that you're up kind of running around doing these things where the rest of us are hiding, trying to rebuild. And it's fascinating to see that the last we saw canonically in the timeline of the Mandalorians was in Rebels, when Sabine gives the dark saber to Bo-Katan, and we don't really know what happens after that. And the show kind of they don't address it immediately. They just know something happened.
Right.
And it's fascinating to see how we kind of have to figure it out along the way. And Star Wars is kind of notorious for doing that. We kind of have to figure out the story from what happened before we got dropped in.
Yes.
And the implications for the Mandalorians, of course, we're going to learn more about it, but it's just fascinating to see how this culture was very prominent, very well organized and militarized. And now they're just kind of a bunch of, cults basically just living underground in sewers. They're not prominent like they once were.
There are two things that I find really interesting about Mandalorian culture in The Mandalorian. One of them is that the New Republic and the remnants of the Empire do have some political power in the galaxy, but the Mandalorians are out of that loop. Mm-hmm. Like the New Republic is not thinking about Mandalorians. The remnants of the Empire, Moff Gideon is thinking about the Mandalorians because of the lightsaber, but the remnants of the Empire in general are not thinking about the Mandalorians. And so it's really interesting that in Clone Wars, they are sort of part of the politics of the Clone Wars. But here they're just nobody's thinking about them officially. Are you about to disagree with me?
No, I was going to say I agree. I think they're very the contrast. As you were saying that, it makes me think of the Jedi too. How the Jedi are kind of gone, and Luke's really the last of the Jedi.
Yeah. And
there's a few other Force users out there, but we hear a lot of people in the series when they run into Din and they say, they kind of the way they kind of mythicize the Mandalorians, like aren't your people supposed to?
We've heard the stories. Everybody says we've heard the stories or we read the stories.
Right. Aren't your people supposed to be like this? I thought you guys did this, yada, yada, yada. A lot of misconceptions.
That's
and sometimes
really interesting. That's true. So it's fun.
A lot of people, I guess, have not ran into Mandalorians or had exposure to them, so they don't know except for tales of eons past.
Right. Right. And the thing is that, Mandalore, I assume, gets destroyed at the end of the Clone Wars or at the very beginning of the Empire. And, the original trilogy starts 18 years after that. And this is 5 years after Return of the Jedi. So it's been a while. It's been a generation.
24 years, yeah.
It's been a generation. And so there's lots of people that sort of know that they existed, but most people have never seen them.
Right.
And so when they see Mando, it's sort of, that's why it's called Mando. It's like, I don't know your name, but you're a Mandalorian. The other thing that I find really interesting is, I'm gonna use contemporary language for this, that Din Djarin is part of a fundamentalist group.
Yes.
That they have this very traditional notion of honor and what a Mandalorian is, in contrast with Bo-Katan and her circle of people who have a very different notion of what Mandalorian culture, what Mandalorian things are. As we all know, the people that raised Mando come from the Death Watch, who were sort of like a proto-nationalist, very conservative, very retrograde. I mean, in a way, sort of very reactionary group of Mandalore who wanted to go back to the old ways of being a warrior society. And so that sort of trickles down to the group that Mando is working with. And I love that moment in season 2, episode 3, when he meets Bo-Katan and she takes the helmet off and he's like, whoa, these are not real Mandalorians.
His whole worldview is just,
and their reaction to him is like, oh, he's a Children of the Watch.
He's one of those guys.
One of those guys, that cult, the cult
right.
of the Mandos.
Right.
And so I find it really interesting that that on the one hand, very few people know about Mandalorians. And on the other hand, the show is giving us the internal conflicts that exist within Mandalorian culture after the destruction of Mandalore.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting to have that sort of fundamentalist notion. I mean, in Boba Fett, he is basically kicked out of being a Mandalorian for taking his helmet off. Mm-hmm. And so once again, this sort of very fundamentalist notion, you have committed a sin, you have dishonored Mandalorians, you cannot consider yourself a Mandalorian anymore, which is not the way that Bo-Katan and her circle would think about being a Mandalorian. And it's really interesting to see the conflict between that sort of very fundamentalist notion and that more sort of official or law-abiding or sort of historical idea of the Mandalorians that Bo-Katan is thinking about.
Yeah, I think it's cool to see the evolution during the first 2 seasons of Din's character, how he, like you said, he meets Bo-Katan and his whole worldview is kind of shocked. He thought all Mandalorians followed this code.
Right.
And I think we see him, and we see this in the Clone Wars with Ahsoka and other Jedi. They say they question the ways of their, how they were brought up. Like, and I think that's a classic coming of age, trope. And we get to see Din throughout the series kind of wrestle with that. How, he, like my favorite episode with the Sin, where he goes back and saves Grogu. He has to wrestle with, I did a job, but giving up an innocent child to pretty much these evil people, forget the code, I have to save this child. And we get to see, the Mandalorians do rally around him, but throughout the series, we see him wrestle with, am I a Mandalorian? Can I actually have what I want? And, the reason he takes off his helmet is for as I think you and all the rest of us would say, is a justifiable reason. To the Mandalorians, it's not. He did it to save Grogu.
Right.
But it's funny and interesting to see. I would love to see where it goes. The armor, I think, is a very fascinating character who I really love, and I want to see kind of what she's going to do in the future. But just the fact we get to see not just the audience, but Din himself question, what are these men? He was raised in this. This is the only thing he knows. And when you grow up into something like that, when your worldview gets shattered, or flipped on its head, it's how do you wrestle with that? And we're kind of seeing that play out.
Yep, it's when your small world breaks into the larger world, and you realize that there are other ways of living.
It's not so black and
white. That
are
being a Mandalorian, but they're not the way that you thought.
Right.
That
we're told to believe. Yeah,
and that's very fascinating. In a way, that's why I'm sort of calling it a fundamentalist group.
Yeah.
Because they're basically creating a very strict code of behavior, and that anything outside of that code is anathema, is a sin, is dishonorable, is non-Mandalorian, and I find that really, really, really interesting in the way that the characters react to it, and in the way that the story is being told. Because I'm sort of curious about, what is Din Djarin going to do now? Like, is he going to accept that he's not a Mandalorian, or is he going to find a way of redefine what Mandalorianism is? I just invented a word, to sort of continue his identity. Because I think his identity as a bounty hunter is more connected to sort of being a survivor.
Mm-hmm.
But his identity as a Mandalorian, for him, is part of his core. And so he's being told that he's not a Mandalorian anymore. I'm sure is going to have consequences and effects and decisions in season 3. Oh my God, Carmelo's speculating. All the police, Carmelo's speculating.
It's okay. It happens.
No, because I'm really curious about the outcome of this.
Mm-hmm.
And what Din Djarin is going to do about that. So that's really fun. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I think one thing I won't speculate too much, but one thing I'm curious about, and
hey, I speculated, so you can speculate.
Well, one thing I'm curious about is how this show will end, or what will happen to not just Din, but the Mandalorians as a whole, because I think we get around to the sequels, we don't really see any Mandalorians.
Yeah.
There's no mention of them at all, and in hindsight, I'm sure they didn't know there would be a series about the Mandalorians called The Mandalorian. So there was really no reason to bring it up. But there's not even a reference really. I think there's nothing. A Mandalorian. I think Maz Kanata has a flag of the mythosaur at her castle.
Right.
But other than that, there's not really a mention or a history of any brought up about them. So it would be fascinating to see if they're going to be kind of extinct by that point. So.
It's really interesting. When I was doing my Mandalorian marathon this week, I remember thinking, there is no mention of Mandalorian culture in the sequel trilogy. So I'm sort of curious how the show is going to answer that question or resolve that question. Like, is it going to become an isolationist planet? Sort of like, we're not going to deal with the rest of the galaxy. We're just going to rebuild ourselves, our destroyed planet. Who knows? There's a moment in season 2 that I adored, because it's something that had already happened in Star Wars fiction, but had not happened yet on visual narratives, on screen narratives. That moment where it's at the beginning of the last episode of the second season, when they catch the cloning Dr. Pershing.
Okay.
And that soldier is talking with Cara Dune, and they're talking about Alderaan, and they're talking about the Death Star. Oh. And they're having that conversation, which reminds me very much of Lost Stars, by Claudia Gray, and the idea of the Imperials also lost something. Mm-hmm. And so there's this really interesting conversation between Cara Dune and that Imperial soldier about, yes, I was there when they destroyed your planet, but do you realize how many people died in both of the Death Stars? And so it was really interesting to have that, the sort of complexity of war mentioned on a television show. Because in the movies, this is never a discussion. In the television shows, this is never a discussion. And the animated shows are happening before the Death Star, so there's no conversation on it. But I thought it was really, really fun that something that had appeared in fiction, like complexity of what does it mean to go to war and what are the consequences of war, shows up in that episode. I love that moment. I love that moment.
Well, and we mentioned earlier that it just takes place shortly after the original trilogy, and we get to see some characters in the show mention, we get to see like there's a change happening with the New Republic. They're taking over, trying to, make things more peaceful with the remnants of the Empire. But we see Imperial credits are still used in some part of the galaxy.
Right.
We get to see that some people aren't really fond of the New Republic. They're like, things are worse than it was when the Empire was here. There's chaotic. There's no really law and order. It's just every man for himself. And so we do get to see some complexity of the larger galaxy, which I appreciate.
And it's really interesting because in The Mandalorian, we are in the margins of the galaxy. We're in the outer rim. We're not in Coruscant. We're not in the core planets. And so, like the Western, we are away from civilization. We are away from the capital. We're not in New York City. We're not in even St. Louis, which was the end of civilized the civilized world in the United States at the time. And so it's really interesting that even the setting in the galaxy is connected to it, and therefore this new republic that's being formed barely has any control. Their laws barely are sort of recognized or even obeyed in the margins of the galaxy. So it's fun to see that we are in the far away, the galaxy far away. We're in the far away of the far away.
It's funny. We see when we see Din, actually, I think it's the second episode of season 2 when he's kind of pulled over by the New Republic X-wing pilots, and he's like, "Oh, my code was good with the Empire," and they're like, "Well, that's not how it is anymore."
Right.
And then we see the security when in the Book of Boba Fett when he has to go through like kind of the TSA style airport security. He's kind of like, "This is ridiculous." Kind of even I think some of the characters in Star Wars that are not part of the larger story, they don't really understand they just know that the government they had is kind of gone, even if they don't understand all the evil that the Empire did. The way the structure they had is changing, and it's even more worse than it was before, because we know the Empire was harsher on some planets than others and more of a threat. So it's fun and fascinating to see the everyday lives of just regular people.
Yes. And it's one of the things that I have loved so much. In a way, that's one of the things I love about television in Star Wars, that we get to see the day to day.
Yeah.
I love Kenobi cutting meat every day in the Kenobi show, and taking the little bus back to town, and then getting on the EOP and going to the cave. And it's just, I have loved getting to see how people live in the galaxy, and how different people live in different ways in the galaxy. That's been just wonderful. I just loved it.
Yeah. So Carmelo, as we're wrapping up today, I think anybody who's listening to our podcast, the few of you that do, we appreciate it. But anybody that is listening to us, they know what the Mandalorian is. I think most people, like we said earlier, have seen the Mandalorian, even if they don't consider themselves Star Wars fans, or they've only seen a few movies. So this came out, right after the sequel trilogy ended, and it was, the sequel trilogy has mixed baggage. People love it, people hate it. This show kind of came in right after that and took the pop culture world by storm, and we haven't really looked back from it. And even to this day, we're getting new announcements and information about the future of Star Wars. And I think it all started with The Mandalorian and how it's impacted the plan for Star Wars going forward.
Well, and once again, that sort of corporate angle of all of this. Remember that Mandalorian is the beginning of Disney Plus.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this idea that now there is a streaming service that Disney has for creating more Star Wars content. And we live, for better or for worse, we live in a world where people watch television much more than they go to the movies. And so the idea that Star Wars is veering towards television rather than going and just making more movies makes absolute sense. What I think is remarkable is the sort of doing live action with Star Wars.
Yeah.
And so that is, in a way, that's very unique to Star Wars, because Star Wars, live action Star Wars, was always a movie, was always on film, was always cinema. And that we're putting that holiday special
to the side.
I'm pushing it. You can see me pushing that television show. Setting that one aside, live action was always on film, and so it's really interesting that we're having that switch, and it's really interesting, of course, having that, the introduction of Luke Skywalker in The Mandalorian, which is a character that shows up on the films being brought into television, because he's not in any of the animated shows. He's not in Clone Wars because he wasn't born. He's not in Rebels. Leia is in Rebels, but not Luke. So this is sort of the first. Go ahead.
He's in Rebels. You just don't see him. He's very far off in the distance. In
Rebels.
In Rebels, the episode where Maul and Kenobi have their showdown at the end.
That's right.
But like you said, we don't really see him. We don't know what he's like.
Yeah.
They just allude to him being there. And
right. There's a recognition that he exists.
Right. Just to remember he's around, kind of thing. And
so Mandalorian is responsible for bringing a live action Luke Skywalker back.
Yeah. And it's fascinating too that
the world cried of happiness.
Exactly. And it's fascinating too that we get to see a lot of animated characters make their jump from animation to live action, which has been awesome. And we're getting, Ahsoka, obviously we're both excited for. And we're getting to see her in live action. We got to see her, and that was like, I remember reading the article when that news broke, and I didn't believe it. And then I still was like, I can't believe this is actually happening, until it actually happened. And then we get to see other characters like Bo-Katan, and I'm sure we're gonna see more animated characters.
Cad Bane.
Cad Bane, yes, that's another good one. And all kind of bridge from, obviously Dave Filoni's heavily involved in all these shows, and he loves those characters and created those characters.
Right.
So we get to see more, and I think it just makes the whole Star Wars bigger.
Thrawn is coming. Repent.
Thrawn is coming. Yes.
Thrawn is coming. Repent.
She is coming.
Anyway, guys, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so as we release these episodes, you are notified. And of course, don't forget to like us if you like our video. Yes, thank you very much, Nick.
Yeah, don't forget we're also on Spotify, and I did.
That's right. I always forget that. Sorry.
Yes, that's okay. And I also created a TikTok for us, and I don't get on TikTok much, but I thought, well, this would be fun to kind of spread the word about our podcast and just.
I don't have a TikTok account, but please, thank you very much for promoting it in yet another platform.
Yeah, it's Nick and Melo's Hyperspace. Just search on TikTok. It's mainly just me posting about cool comics I get, or cool Black Series figures I picked up, or I might spill my opinion on some things, but just a way to get us out there and talking more about Star Wars.
Awesome.
So everybody, thank you. And
goodbye, everybody.
We'll see you soon.
May the Force be with you.